Hello and welcome to the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. That was weird. I don't like doing that.
You'll
I'm
get
so
used
used to
to
that
it.
weirdo saying it. I'll get used to it eventually. So tonight we're going to talk about the traditional method. So believe it or not, this is actually a getting ready session, isn't it really? We're trying to get certain things out of our system in advance. If you haven't heard already, as Liam put it, quite frankly, in our first episode, and how we didn't get actually cut off, I do not know. We now have a new YouTube show, should we call it? A Facebook Live YouTube show.
We're on
For
paranormal TV, everyone.
paranormal TV. And yeah, so we obviously have to do a lot simpler version of this because they're not witches. Obviously, as what do you call them, Liam?
Paranitwits.
Paranitwits. So
Or
so we need
paras.
to
Paras for
paras
short.
for
If you're
short.
actually saying it to their face, you just abbreviate it to paras, but really that stands for paranitwits.
Paranitwits. So I'm trying to think when that phrase was coined. Actually, I think we did that quite some time ago. Was it one of the first episodes of the podcast?
I think we got a podcast episode we're supposed to be doing on it. It was an idea for a podcast
Oh,
episode,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so tonight we're supposed to go live this evening. Obviously, this is back in time, or
We're on the
forward in time for you guys.
10th of March, is it today? Yeah, 10th of
Yeah.
March today. We got our episode of Feisty Witches later, which is what we've
Feisty
called the
Witches.
show.
So come and check us out. Obviously, you won't. It's nowhere near as highbrow as this is. But Liam is trying to get up a budget kind of production going on. He was trying really hard last week for episode 3. Or was it? It was episode 3, wasn't it?
I think it was episode
You're doing all your
2.
camera changes and stuff, weren't you?
Oh yeah, it was on Candle Magic, wasn't it? And I had a camera
Yeah.
for the candle and a camera for me, and then you had a camera as well. Oh, it was all so fancy. You don't get that on the
It
YouTube
was.
channel, do you?
So yeah, so we got to get prepared tonight, which our session is going to be on magical charms and traditional folk magic.
No, it's not. It's on Cunning
So we
Folk.
thought,
She's
no, is it?
Karen's,
Cunning Folk. Oh,
Karen-
sorry.
Karen's named the episode Cunning Folk, but
Okay.
this episode now is called
The
Traditional.
traditional
The
method.
traditional magic. Back when witches had balls, even the girls.
Especially the girls.
Yeah, old Fanny
Yeah.
Cranach and the like.
Old Fanny Cranach and the like. Definitely. When is her book going to be ready, Liam?
I have had to shelve it a little bit because the person that is helping her write it, Raven Grimsby, he's actually quite ill at the moment. So he was, because obviously Fanny Cranach, a local cunning woman from the West Country, she's getting on in years and she wants to put her information down in a book. But like a lot of old cunning folk, she's completely illiterate, can't read or write really. So she's got some local Wiccan, Raven Grimsby, to do the writing. She just dictates it and he kind of puts it down in fancy English and spells it all right and that. But no, I have been asked if I will do a forward to the book. So
Oh, okay.
I am going to do one, but it won't be a nice one. So whether that actually gets published or not, we won't know. I don't know if
We'll see.
Troll Books will publish it. I don't know, because I don't intend on giving it a nice review. So, it is going to be one of those things. But yeah, there we go. So you're leading this one, so what's going on tonight then, or today, if you're listening on the car on the way to work or something?
So today we're going to talk about we're going to talk a bit more about Raven Grimsby, aren't we?
Are we?
Because we also had we're going to have we're talking about the fact that we had
Folk magic,
Are we?
traditional
I'm not even sure
methods.
what we're talking about today.
It's called the
I've lost the
traditional
plot.
method. You can see why I normally do the hosting part and the intros and stuff. It's called the traditional method, and we're talking about traditional witchcraft, for crying out loud, and not the
Oh
Kelden sort of
yes.
traditional witchcraft, proper traditional
No,
witchcraft.
we're not talking PKTWs
No, we're
because we do.
talking
Yeah,
we're talking PRKTWs, pre-Kelden traditional witches.
pre-Kelden traditional witches. Okay. Well, then I suggest you tell us a bit more about what you think traditional witchcraft is, Liam, because obviously you're clearly the expert on it,
When I
thanks to our Fanny
think
Crannock.
When I think of, well, I mean, she was my best mentor, Fanny Crannock was. She taught me all of the best dark magic that I know, our Fanny. Uh, Dark is our Fanny.
Somehow I don't think you're allowed to say things like that anymore.
No, but there we go. Um, Bless her, old Fanny Crannock. She is a bit old and whiffy, and she does smell a bit now. But I don't even know how old she is. But I'm looking forward to finding out a little bit more about her because apparently, in her book, Fanny Crannock's Village Witchcraft, there's going to be a section a little bit about her backstory and stuff. So I know she's got interesting relatives and things. And I've heard that, well, she was a bit of a one in the day, and she's picked up with many ceremonial magician stuff, quite famous people apparently. So I'm looking forward to that. But there we go. So anyway, so what was your question? Sorry.
Give us a flavour for what you consider traditional witchcraft to be.
Okay.
PRKDW.
Okay. So I would say PRKW is magical practice that comes from Europe from the medieval period until the 20th, round about 20th century. Um, Early 20th century, maybe before. So it ends really by the end of the Victorian period. The reason for that is I think that magical practice changes considerably when we get to the 20th century, particularly with the invention of the NHS and with
Yeah,
police and stuff like that. Access that everyday people have to law
changes.
enforcement, science,
Healthcare.
education, healthcare, all that makes a big, big difference. So what we've got is really that word witchcraft and kind of what it
Yeah,
means. Because the problem is that throughout that period of time, from medieval period onwards, the word witchcraft actually does seem to change a lot. So depending on who's using the word, it has many, many, many different connotations. It originally starts with being, it's always negative, it's baneful, maleficent, black, evil magic. If you practice
left
black
hand
evil
path.
magic, well, not modern left-hand path, no, because we know that they're all a bunch of, well, never mind. Um, yeah, but it is bad magical practice, essentially, and quite
Yeah,
mysterious, because, of course, back then, you wouldn't start normally coming out and saying, well, I'm a black witch, I'm this, I'm a working against you, because there was a lot of laws in place, and that was a very scary thing to do. So if there were witches a working, they would be doing it in secret. Now,
yeah, in the broom closet.
in the broom closet, which there would have been an actual broom closet back then as well. um, so, whereas what happens is as it changes, because there's witchcraft laws that prohibit maleficent evil magic and labels people that practice that as witches, the powers that be tend to say if they don't like you, then they'll prosecute you, steal all your property, throw you in jail, maybe even kill you in some instances. And,
Burn the witch.
burn the witch, hang the witch, drown the witch, all that stuff. So what you've kind of got is you've got people that aren't really practicing maleficent magic, but they're still getting prosecuted for witchcraft. Some of it's hysteria, like the famous witchcraft trials of Salem, Massachusetts. There weren't really any
Yeah,
witches there. It's just completely hysterical people. Other instances, there are magical practices, but they're not necessarily baneful. So if you've
yeah,
got the priest, the local parish priest, and that parish priest doesn't like having to put up with a certain old wise woman, he might,
She's got more clients.
yeah, he might accuse said old wise woman of witchcraft. So she might be a magical folk healer or something like that. Don't matter.
Midwife.
He's just going to turn around and say, she's a witch, get rid of her. Similarly, like you've said before about in terms of it's very easy to pick on certain types of people. So if you've got someone that goes against the
Spinster.
grain, that's a little unusual. Say you've got a woman that's never married and she's quite wealthy. What was the ways of targeting said women, Chris? You know, to steal their property.
Targeting a spinster?
Yeah, targeting a spinster.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because, either they've not had children and therefore haven't had to go through the costly process of bringing up children. Obviously, very different cost to now. But if you've been able to, because you not only don't have children, so you've got less outgoing, but you've also got more incoming because you're able to work for longer. So, these spinsters were able to, make yarn, make cloth, other, handicrafts that were able to make them money, which means they were single women with lots of money and lots of influence because of it, because money talks. As opposed to, these other women. The other option is, back in the day, you could still acquire finances if you were a widow. And until you were married again, you were actually independent. It's about the only time you were, is after your husband died. So, most men that wanted to progress were trying to marry the rich widow. Get me words out. In order to control her influence and her finances.
As well as that society worked a lot differently in that if you're a pleb in the lower classes, you haven't really got a lot. But if you're even just a local magistrate and you're in with the local parish council or the controlling council or whatever offices that are local, then that's essentially cementing your position of power as well. So if you've got someone, maybe she's a slightly wealthier older lady that owns a bit of land that she's inherited, but if you accuse that person of witchcraft, that land and such doesn't then pass on. She hasn't got any heirs, so that'll get absorbed into the local county, which you'll run and own. So literally you can see it as a case of, well, that woman over there, she's a little bit crazy. If I say she's a witch, we can seize all of her land, throw her in the slammer, and no one will care because they'll think she's a witch. Now, I know in the 90s specifically, there's a lot of kind of feminism that went on that kind of pushed that kind of, well, witches were always strange women that were rebelling against the patriarchy and stuff. And there may be situations of that, but let's not label witchcraft in that tiny bracket. I mean, when you go to France, for example, far more men were prosecuted for witchcraft than women. So you've got the Cunning Folk over there. So it's not really as simple as saying...
It's not that simple.
It's actually a very muddy word, the word witch, and it's got a lot of connotations and a lot of history, and it changes. Because people often, I've heard magical practitioners say, oh, well, they never used the term white witch or black witch or anything like that. Well, actually, they did back in the 1700s, because it changed from being a witch is just a bad practitioner to all of these other local cunning folk being labelled as witches, to the local cunning folk saying, well, okay, yeah, fine, I'm a witch, whatever. If you're going to call me a witch, but I'm a good witch. I'm not a bad witch. I'm a good witch. So then you've got the word witch meaning bad, magical practitioner, to it meaning magical practitioner, to people not being able to distinguish between magical practitioners. So then they come out with these ideas of that person's a black witch, or I'm a white witch, or I'm a this, or I'm a that. And it's just gone from there, really. I mean, it's a I wouldn't say polluted word, but it's a word with a huge amount of history. And I do wonder sometimes, past the 20th century, when things got a little bit love and light, because the root of traditional witchcraft, I think if I was to sum it up, is survival. That's what it's about. It's about
Survival is a really
You
good way to put that.
you are someone with magical knowledge of herb lore, potions, all of that sort of thing, divination, and you're able to service that community. That community needs you. You're an integral part of that community. If there aren't any police, if there aren't any doctors, you play a very important role within that community. And because you are different, and you will be different, all different people are to a certain extent kind of outcasts, aren't they? So
Yeah, and in order to do that job, you've kind of got to be that. Is that that you've got to be that different person that everybody knows of, but nobody necessarily knows. It's one of them, isn't it? Where you kind of they're so reliant on said person, that they've got to kind of remain a little bit aloof because they're
yeah.
too busy. Um, because you literally would be doing everything that's necessary. From one day you might be
Mm.
delivering babies, for example, to the next day you might be, cursing an entire family line
Yeah.
of crop bearers.
So there's a couple of things that is really important that we pick up on. We're probably going to talk about hereditary witchcraft at some point, but let's leave that for the Patreon
Yeah,
because we can. So let's leave that
yeah,
for the
let's do that
Patreon, and
because we
instead
can.
let's really delve into the archetypes and difference, that kind of cut-off point of the 20th century when it stops being really traditional witchcraft and starts turning into something else. And you can tell by the
Yeah,
work that the people do. So if you look back at all the references to Cunning Folk and you do a little bit of digging, you'll find that the Cunning Folk would help farmers. There'd be midwifery there'd be veterinary skills, there'd be this, there'd be that. It was all necessary for everyday
yeah,
life. If your chickens
yeah,
came down ill or your livestock came down ill and there aren't vets, the farmer would know an awful lot about their livestock. Don't forget that. A lot of these farmers, they're
yes,
raised with a huge amount of knowledge that gets passed along. Even farmers today know a huge amount. If they're proper farmers and not just the people that move from the city and buy a little bit of land and start rearing sheep, but proper farmers and that around
yeah.
here, they can speak about,
Because
yeah,
vets are
yes.
expensive.
Um,
So
but if you're looking at what the witches did, you're talking about very, very practical things, utilizing things that are around the house or on
yeah,
their local lands. There is no eBay, there is no dedicated magical tools because you can't afford that.
they're not they're not ordering crystals in
No.
from China and
You don't have
Malaysia.
necessarily tarot cards. You might have some playing cards if you're lucky, but you wouldn't have that. What you would have is you'd have a fresh batch of eggs from your hen house. So you might crack
Yeah,
an egg and do egg reading or
yeah,
something like that, which still survives in various different places. But most of the time, people associate things like tarot cards with witchcraft, divination, and stuff. If you move to the 20th century, people do still go to professional witches. They still do go to seek out the art of magic, or practitioners that so say practice the art of magic. But they come for very different things. They don't necessarily come for healing unless it's something the doctor says they can't fix. They don't necessarily come always
fix.
for justice because they have the police and such. What they do tend to come for is, I want to speak to the dead, or I have a terminal condition,
Yeah,
or how can you help me with this because the courts have failed. So now you've got less the local cunning woman down the road, quick fetch her, I've broken my leg and I don't want it to be infected. Now it's a case of, well, I went to the doctors and we've had all these scans and that. They still can't tell me why it is, and now they're saying they might have to amputate my leg. What can I do? Oh, I'm going to have to go and look at other alternative therapies and practices.
you're not going to do some Reiki then?
Let's not talk about Reiki. Come on, please don't talk about Reiki on this. But so the archetype of the traditional witch is what lives. The archetype of no nonsense,
Yeah,
straight to the point, survivalist and necessary,
jack of all
jack of all
trades.
trades, or a specialist, because that's the thing. We talk about witches nowadays, I think we think of like a doctor. You go to school and you learn an awful lot about medicine, Whereas back then, you may be
Yeah.
talking about certain cunning folk, particularly, that maybe only specialised in certain charms and things that got passed along. You don't always have. It was more of a case of the more famous you are, or infamous, more likely, the more you could do. And yes, there are instances of cunning folk
Yeah.
practicing magical arts. There are ones I did a blog post on. Farmers and stuff managing to, those that were illiterate, getting hold of um, Heinrich Agrippa's free books of occult philosophy. So there are cunning folk and stuff that had access to
Yeah.
that. But yeah, so what about the archetype then, Chris? How do you see the archetype of the traditional witch? Does it vary from what I've kind of said, or?
What do we mean, the modern one,
Well,
or do we
traditional
mean
witch. So what springs to
the
mind when you think of traditional witch? Because I kind of just, summed up a little bit about trying to slot it into periods of history. Because before medieval times, were there witches? Did the word exist?
It's one of those, isn't it? We've touched on this before, where essentially the the word doesn't exist, but the
Yeah.
archetype does. So you would use you would think, if you go back to kind of the classical period or before, you've got a different set of archetypes. You've still got the spinster, so the traditional witch kind of is still there in that sense, as the archetype in that way, where it is the crone part, where these modern folks steal the crone idea from, of this cunning wise woman, good with handicraft, good with words, very knowledgeable. You've also got kind of priestesses and sorceresses, are your different kinds of categories that you get of witches. You also get kind of your demigods and stuff, where you've got the closest you get is these kind of sorceresses, which are kind of half divine. And then you get seers and priestesses and all those sorts of things that are able to command energy or ask and petition on your behalf. So that's the kind of intermediary kind of stances. You don't have necessarily the word witch, which for me, witch is still is a very practical word. That bits you were saying about cunning folk throughout different periods and stuff, and traditional practitioners, is that practical
Mm.
aspect. And I think that's sometimes what's lost in modern representations of the word witch, is we lose some of that
Well, it
practical
starts being turned
stuff.
into a religion.
It's gone a little bit too, yeah, a religion, or it gets too magical,
Yeah.
too Disney, where they're trying to talk about concepts that are bigger than the day to day. And I think that's what's kind of lost in some of the modern translation part. But is but yeah, my traditional archetype of a witch. So when I think of her, I think of, yeah, that wise woman or man. I still can't help going towards the feminine. I know that is wrong, and I know how wrong that is, but it doesn't stop my brain going there for the
Mm.
archetype. Is going back to this kind of, uncouth um, person from the edge of society that was integral but left at the peripheral, like that whole point of it existed with, and they do fall in and out of favour. Like, I do think of that kind of, like, where they go a bit dodgy, and that one moves on, and we get a new wise woman that comes in. I think some people think of them as part of that they don't travel. I think is part that I think often gets there, is that they've always been there. She's 300 years old, she is. Where I think kind of, whether it's a mantle, it's a title that kind of carries from which to another. So, maybe this Merlin guy did exist for, 300-400 years, and actually it was a title as opposed to a person, and actually went from one to the other. Obviously, Merlin is also that cute little bird, isn't it? There's a whole species of owls that are called
Yeah.
Merlins. Um, that those kind of link-ins for me always tie into that mythology. I think what's so special about the traditional witch is that mythology that goes with it, they must have been so important based on the fact that the mythology is so rich. That the archetype is so strong. Which nowadays kind of splits into kind of mage and witch and all that kind, all sorceress and all those different words that form different archetypes of classes of witch from the olden days that you don't see now. And they haven't translated. The mythology is still intact, I think, for me. That they kind of exist still in their own period. Like we look back at them, and even with the kind of, the PKTWs, is that kind of trying to reach back at it and touch at it, even though it would never work in the public, in the modern day, because they would never fulfill that role now, because they're not needed as midwives and as a replacement for a doctor or a a replacement for lower level country disputes. It would be, that's the other part that often is forgotten. You might have the wise woman is the woman that you went to when you'd got a dispute, a kind of civil dispute between two people that kind of goes, no, that corner of that that field, he's been cutting into my part of the land for so long, and they would settle disputes between farmers before you had formal land rights and magistrates. Before they existed, they would settle disputes like that in some parts of kind of Eastern Europe and Russia. That those women still exist. There is women that you would go to that between two, he reneged on my deal, and you would go to the local wise woman to settle that dispute. Like, they depending on the time period and the parts of the world that you're in, they don't exist. I don't think they really exist nowadays in the UK, or they're trying, like Fanny, to pass on their information before they go. But the actual role itself doesn't really exist
only within
the
families. What you will find is you find the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, who is the person which, when the family is in dispute, that's normally the person that settles it. Well, imagine that person, that matriarch or patriarch, the respected member of the family. Imagine that person being the person in the village, and imagine the family being the village. And they're normally that person for a reason. It's because they're strong and necessary. So they might not be the leader that wants leadership and wants to lead, but they are the person that everyone knows. They're the person that everyone relies on. They're the person the witch. So we've got literally like 3 minutes left, and I think that there's a super important point. Whenever you pick up a book on traditional witchcraft that's supposed to be pre-Celtic traditional witchcraft, you're only ever looking at Cunning Folk practices. I've got a book called Cursed Britain. I think it's a crap book because it talks about Cursed Britain, supposedly a history of black magic. It doesn't talk about black magic, it talks about Cunning Folk practices. The cunning man or wise woman was the person you went to undo the black magic that's set upon you. So where are these secret practitioners, the original black magic, the witches that were the original witches when the word just meant maleficent magic? Where were they throughout the ages, from the medieval period onwards? Where are they today? And why don't we know about their practices? And I think we've only got 1 minute left, so we might have to actually answer that one in the Patreon, which is worth joining the Patreon, clearly.
But I'll try as quickly as I can, but I think that in the short, the answer is they probably do still exist, but at the same time, are they necessary in the same way that they once were? Because those sorts of people were the people that, were the revenge. They were the harpies of the world, the vengeful ones. that were gone to in order to deal with it. Nowadays, I suppose you've got hitmen
Well, you've got
instead.
like the Brujas Mexico, you've got the bad witches that you'd go to screw over
Yeah,
your ex-husband or something. And then you do see a lot of that still today. But, and we're out of time now, so I'm going to have to continue on the Patreon.